Although the Supreme Court ruled in a landmark decision that prevented employers from terminating LGBTQ identifying employees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, there is still work to be done to reach full inclusion in the workplace. To discuss this, I'm now joined by Erin Uritus, CEO of Out and Equal, a nonprofit organization dedicated to achieving full workplace equality for LGBTQ plus people. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Erin, just to start off with, I have this some stats in front of me. A 2021 survey by the Williams Institute found that 1 in 10 LGBTQ workers experienced discrimination at work in the last year. LGBTQ employees of color were more likely to report being denied jobs and to experience verbal harassment. How does training like what you do at Out and Equal help solve and alleviate these situations?
Great question. And I think we're attacking it from many fronts, and companies are really right alongside us in doing so. I mean, at a fundamental level, training provides people with the language and the concepts and the knowledge of how our community is evolving, and that's really important. I think second, we are seeing companies engage with organizations like us to focus on agency and allyship, right? So that the trainings include real suggestions, real life examples, and again, the language so that people can stand up for each other as allies. And third is, I think, even more specifically on the second point, or to draw that out a little bit, is how to make change within your organization. So it's connecting employees who go through training with the employee resource groups, for example, who are an employee engagement mechanism where they can be agents of change on the job.
Could you give us a snapshot of how corporate America and what corporate America is doing to really achieve true equality? And what grade would you give them overall on equality in the workplace when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community?
I think it's tough to give a grade, but I think I'll step back and just give you some context that, listen, I think we've made extremely big strides in the last 20, 25 years. Even when we started, Julia, 20 years ago, more than 22 years ago, less than 4% of Fortune 500 companies had any protection for the LGBTQ community. So, I think that when you look at, I'm encouraged by progress that I see when you look at indices like HRC's Corporate Equality Index, and you see how many more companies continue to reach for that bar every year and have inclusive policies and benefits. That is in itself encouraging. I think your previous guests have talked a lot about the cultural and political backlash right now, the challenges that exist, and those are real. At the same time, corporate America, organizations at large, I think, have also really strengthened their muscle and their voice as the years have progressed to become voices for the kind of employees that work for them, which is a diverse set of employees, and are really standing up for what is best for business. And so, bottom line, I think there's still work to go, right? There's still progress to be made. Companies still need to do work on the basics if they haven't looked at their benefits and their policies, how they spend money on their LGBTQ employee resource groups. But at the same time, we need, for all the reasons that your guests have said before me, we really need to solidify our voice. We need to think about reaching out across movements and joining in solidarity for essentially as a workplace where everybody feels like they belong.
Right. And a key phrase you used there was what's best for business. Obviously, any workplace should be striving and achieving true equality among all of its employees. But, what's the business case for LGBTQ plus inclusion? How does this ultimately benefit businesses? I know it seems like an obvious question, but I don't think we're at the point where we should be yet with inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, so listen, there's a lot of research that's been done already that shows that workplaces where people feel they can be authentically themselves out and themselves, whatever kind of identity and background they come from, are more productive, effective, creative, right? And that the bottom line for businesses is better. It's why when we were in front of the Supreme Court a couple of years ago for this monumental case, that more than 215 businesses signed on to an amicus brief saying that this is simply bad for business, is that if we do not protect workers' rights. Yeah, I mean, the business case, it is very strong. I would also tell you that as more and more people come out, and especially at younger generations, so even between millennials and Gen Z, Julia, there is an explosion of kids identifying as LGBTQ, and that should grab the attention of businesses if their current state and how they're currently addressing their customers, employees, has not captured their attention yet. Because the more these kids and future talent are coming into their workplaces, the bigger of an issue it's going to be. And so we are encouraging everybody to jump on this train now. And there's lots of support to do so. This work is not easy, but it is going to be better for their business if they focus on this.
So, do most companies and businesses already have non-discrimination policies and protections in place? And really, is there any sort of gap between protections in companies' books and workers' abilities to actually, be their authentic selves at work?
I love this question because there's two parts to this. One is that more and more companies, as I mentioned, have policies, better benefits on the books. But I think that, again, if these things exist, but people can still not come out at work, or they still feel like they cannot be their true selves in meetings and with their colleagues, it doesn't much matter. I mean, it doesn't matter completely to their work experience. And so this is really the second part of the question, which is, this idea that people have heard about time and time again, it's really gained traction in popular culture, is this idea of belonging, right? But belonging is not just this, it shouldn't just be this kind of soft term that remains undefined for us. And it's why we have a tagline called the business of belonging, is that this is really hard work, complicated. It is also a journey, but that it is really working towards optimal organizational culture. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And so are there gaps? Yes, the gaps are between, for those that have the policy and benefits, and really optimal cultures. And that is, there's a lot of work to do there. But again, I think companies get it and they're really working towards it.
So we've talked about, general equality in the workplace among employees in general. But what about in leadership? Do you think there's an appetite in corporate America for LGBTQ leadership at the top of many of these major companies and corporations?
I just love that we're actually having this question now, right? The question itself shows how far we've come. I mean, listen, there's an appetite for it because the more people are out and in the workplace and growing in the ranks, the more you see people like Tim Cook and Tim Federling from Dow out, Beth Ford, for example. Visibility, the more visibility will attract more people coming out. And so, I think there's not just an appetite for it. I think there's a real resonance within the workplace because people are coming out as themselves and they're telling their stories, and those stories cut across identities. And again, in the spirit of authenticity and why authenticity is so important to workplace culture, I think there's a huge, not just appetite, but resonance for not just employees, but for customers as well.
Right. And, in terms of people of color, when we talk about intersectionality within the LGBTQ plus community, people of color, women and trans people are more likely to experience loneliness in their workplace. And I'm sure I can imagine that's a very lonely place to be. How can that ultimately impact performance, and how can companies create an environment where they feel welcome, where they feel like there's a community that may not necessarily understand what they go through day to day, but has their back?
Gosh, I mean, from a tactical level, there's just so many things, but again, not easy because it's this holy grail of good organizational culture, right? I mean, people, first of all, we need more of everybody, of every different kinds of people in the workplace. So efforts on talent, recruitment, retention for specific groups so that you don't lose people, that you don't lose the visibility of those people as they gain traction in their organizations. I think that's really important. Supporting and funding actually these employee resource groups as mechanisms where people of certain identities can find each other, right? And that the company supports employees in their engagement in these mechanisms. There are LGBTQ ERGs are only one of probably about 15 or 20 kinds. So there are ERGs for people of color, for women, for vets, for mental health right now. And these are really, we call them belonging accelerators, Julia, because they're just such a great way to get people engaged, to get people building relationships, which, by the way, is good for business, on the work front. And so those are just a few things that I think companies can do.
Erin, thank you so much for your time on this very important topic. I mean, as someone who considers themselves an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, it's been amazing to see the growth in corporations and other sectors and groups around the country when it comes to LGBTQ plus involvement. So we really appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for having me.